Okay, great. Well, it's a pleasure to be able to talk to all of you today and to share some ideas with you and talk about the significance of research and scholarship to understanding, some of the biggest dynamics that are shaping debate over climate change today. And what I'm going to focus on are particularly the role of so-called public intellectuals, high-profile authors, journalists, writers, people like Naomi Klein, who's the author most recently of This Changes Everything, people like Bill McKibben. Probably most of you probably know Bill McKibben and Naomi Klein. People like Tom Friedman, who writes for the New York Times, the author of Hot, Flat, and Crowded. These journalists, these public intellectuals, in some cases academics, have become sort of the meaning makers, the framers, the definers of what climate change means for society. Why does the issue matter? Who's to blame? What's responsible? And what should be done? They inspire social movements. They shape the actions of government leaders or influence the thinking of government leaders and the leaders of big environmental groups and organizations. And they influence the storylines and the frames of reference that other journalists and writers bring to the issue. So I'm going to talk about who these public intellectuals are. How do they gain their authority? How is it that they influence debate, motivate us, inform us, sometimes maybe anger us if we disagree with what they have to say, create controversy, shape policy. But before I get to that subject, I want to talk about sort of some deeper, sort of more foundational principles around how does the media influence how we understand climate change? Because as a researcher and a scholar, most of my work has been looking at general public opinion. How does the public make sense of complex science, technology, and environmental issues like climate change? What role does the media play in shaping public understanding, both public understanding of the issue and their preferences for what should be done? So this week, this week we have two leading examples of how the framing, the understanding of climate change, how we talk about climate change has shifted dramatically over the last 5 years. Since our debate around cap and trade legislation in 2009 and 2010, when climate change was predominantly talked about as a scientific issue, as an environmental problem, and maybe an economic issue. What are the costs and benefits of action? So terms that are highly technical, terms that have significance for people who are studying the problem, who work closely on the problem, who have always followed it passionately, but maybe not for the broader public. And what we've seen over the last couple of years, though, is a shift away from talking about climate change exclusively as a science, environmental, and economic issue to now, as President Obama did this spring on CBS this morning, talking about climate change not just as an environmental threat, but as a public health threat. And the significance of climate change to things like childhood asthma, infectious disease, and injury or death from extreme weather events or displacement from extreme weather events. And in connection with talking about more of the human dimensions of climate change is a public health threat, we've also seen then discussion of public health being paired with a very strong moral framing of the issue that didn't really exist in the public eye in 2009, 2010. The most recent example of this is Pope Francis' encyclical on the environment, in which he, drawing on both religious and secular tradition, argues the moral duty to act on climate change and other environmental problems because these threats are a danger to the most vulnerable in society. And we have a moral duty to protect the most vulnerable. And also connecting the issue closely to social justice in issues like income inequality. So as a researcher starting in graduate school, 15 years ago, I've always been interested and fascinated by how these complex science, technology, and environmental issues evolve in their meaning in media coverage and in public understanding, and in terms of how experts, scientists, and advocates talk about them. And its root, in general, this is the principle for how public intellectuals, as we'll talk about, shape our understanding of these problems. But first, I'm going to talk more about the general psychology of how this influence works. About 5 years, well, actually more like 10 years ago now, I started looking at research in the social sciences and doing work in an area that's an interdisciplinary area of research called framing. How many people have heard of research on framing or read about it? Good. Okay, so at least some of you have some background knowledge. And this research goes back 30 years in fields like psychology, communication, political science, and economics. And one of the general findings of research on framing is that our perceptions of reality and how we make decisions, how we perceive the world, is heavily context dependent. In fact, we look to how issues are being talked about by others and people we trust, or being portrayed in the media to set the context of our perception. So in this case, climate change in many ways is this complex, ambiguous issue for us. There's many dimensions. We don't know much about it. And this is a classic experiment they did on framing where they showed people an ambiguous stimulus, an ambiguous thing like climate change, in this case, this figure on the screen. If we set the context for that ambiguous stimulus around certain dimensions over others, we will perceive that ambiguous stimulus in a very specific way. So in this case, on climate change, we talk about it as an economic, an environmental, or economic and science issue, we might perceive it one way. With this ambiguous stimulus, if we set the conditions or the context perceptions as two letters, what might first look unclear to you is now very clear as a letter B. But if we change the context for perception, how we talk about the issue, how we portray the issue in the media to something else, we take the same ambiguous stimulus. If we take climate change and talk about it in a different way, and we set the context, say, for example, climate change being a public health problem and a moral imperative, you're going to potentially view that issue very differently and arrive at different judgments as to why it matters, who's to blame, what's responsible, and what are the policy options that should be pursued, or whether or not even support those policy options. So about 5 years ago, in collaboration with my colleague Ed Maybach, who's a professor at George Mason University, we started to try to scientifically study how this process works, looking at this process among the general public. And as I'll get to as I move across my talk, I'll be talking about how this process, the same principles that apply to the general public, also shape how so-called elites come to judgments and decisions about climate change, journalists, experts even, environmentalists, philanthropists, and others. So we started, though, with survey research that Ed and his collaborator, Tony Letherowitz at Yale had done, where they started to not look at the public in binary terms as Republicans versus Democrats, liberals versus conservatives, but rather using sophisticated survey techniques, asking questions, like 40 different questions about people's knowledge, attitudes, and beliefs about climate change and their preferences, to statistically segment them, like you would do in a marketing campaign, into unique audience groups, from those who are strongly alarmed about the issue to those who are strongly dismissive. When you start to do this, what's interesting about this presentation and analysis of public opinion data is no longer is the public viewed in binary terms, but now you can see, for example, that those who are strongly committed to action to those who are strongly dismissive, on average, that's really only about 25% of the public who have really arrived at incredibly solid opinions about the issue. They can't really sway one way. But in between, you have a relative continuum of sort of ambivalence about the topic. Some people are concerned and cautious, others are disengaged, they don't really think about it, others are skeptical but not completely dismissive. So what we wanted to do is looking within each one of these audience groups, we wanted to see if climate change was shifted, the framing of the presentation of climate change was shifted from talking about it as an environmental problem to a public health threat. How did these different groups respond? What opinions did they express back to us? What were their preferences? So we started out by going to the National Mall and we interviewed about 90 people, equally proportioned to each one of these segments. As they walked by, we asked them 15 items that placed them into one of these segments, and then they sat with us in the sculpture garden on the National Mall. We have people from across the country, 29 different states that we interviewed. And we talked to them in an open-ended way about what were their attitudes, beliefs about climate change, what were their preferences. And at this point in 2009, almost no one mentioned climate change as a public health problem. It wasn't an available, salient framing for the issue because the media wasn't talking about, political leaders weren't talking about, environmental groups weren't talking about. At the end of that interview, then, we presented people with an essay where the essay talked about the public health risks of climate change and then the benefits to the public health if we acted. And we asked people then to mark up the essay if they found anything especially compelling and useful about the essay by sentence, and anything particularly that they didn't find very useful. And we took the average of those two ratings. And you can see that for those people who are even dismissive and doubtful about the issue, as they get towards the end of the essay, talking about climate change as a public health problem and the benefits to action, their favorability, their positive reaction to the proposals goes way up. You know, people support actions on climate change when it's framed as a public health problem and paired with the benefits to public health. This was significant to us. This told us we were onto something, that if political leaders like President Obama and environmental groups, both as a communication strategy and potentially as a legal or policy strategy, started to redefine climate change as a public health threat, as they are now with the EPA rules, it might start to soften public opposition to the problem. We then went to an online survey, and we embedded experiments in this online survey with a nationally represented sample of Americans. And some members of that survey read an essay about climate change where climate change was framed as an environmental problem and then the benefits to the environment. Others read an essay where it's framed as a national security threat and then the benefits to national security. And then others read an essay about climate change being a public health problem and the threat to public health. And one of the interesting things that we found on the other side here is that our expectation was the public health framing would be engaging, particularly those people in the middle. And we're looking at people's emotional reactions, whether they reacted with anger or hope. But we also thought the national security frame would also be influential, particularly to those who were dismissive, who tend to be more conservative in their outlook. But we had the exact opposite result. People who were dismissive of the problem reacted to that presentation of climate change in visceral, angry ways. It's called a boomerang effect. It suggested that actually what we think might work with the general public talking about climate change, framing it as a national security threat, might actually backfire. And the other study we looked at then was not talking about climate change specifically, but talking about energy security and our vulnerability to spikes in energy prices and the impact of those spikes in energy prices. And one of the things that we found that was a really interesting result from that research was an exact opposite perception of the problem of energy security. We asked people about the economic impacts and the public health impacts if gas prices were to triple over the next 5 years. And this is back in 2010, we were really concerned about a spike in gas prices. But it sort of measures people's anxiety about volatility in energy prices. And what we found, interestingly, both for economic impacts and public health impacts, it was those people who were most dismissive of climate change who had the highest latent risk perceptions around energy insecurity and energy volatility. This suggests that we're missing out on a way to talk about climate change in terms of energy security, not in terms of supply problem where we need more drilling, but in terms of an efficiency and innovation problem and a resilience problem, where we create new technologies and new efficiency technologies and improve the resilience of our energy grid as a way to face things like energy shortages in the face of extreme weather. This is something that a line of reasoning and talking about and communicating about climate change that might open up the conversation. So this was really interesting to me. This fit with long-standing theory in the social sciences and how people make sense of complex issues. And it suggested that the lens through which we view climate change, the storyline that's provided to us, the frame of reference that's emphasized, can strongly shape public judgments, preferences, and decisions. But around the same time that these studies came out, in a different grant project I was looking at, I started looking more now at expert decision-making and thinking, well, maybe the same principles that apply to the public and how frames of reference shape public decisions might also shape how the advocacy community and the expert community have thought about climate change as a social problem and what should be the technologies and policy actions pursued. And so as part of that research, I started looking at the strategy documents and the planning of the biggest foundations that fund action on climate change, both research and policy action, and also communication. And they came together in 2007 with a strategy document called the Design to Win document, where they interviewed about 50 experts and wrote this strategy document that they would inform then up to $1 billion in funding over the next 5 to 10 years, as they talked about in the report. And what was interesting to me as I read the document that came out really only months after Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth documentary came out, is that the framing of the problem, climate change is a social problem, what the solutions should be, tracked very closely with the framing of the problem in Al Gore's documentary. In this case, the main solution was to achieve a price on carbon through a cap and trade system. A market-based, social change started with the marketplace. And then the other assumption is that we have all the technology we need in terms of efficiency and renewables to reduce emissions. We don't have to think about other technologies like nuclear energy. There was almost no mention in the report at the time of natural gas as a bridge fuel. And that climate change is solvable. It's easily solvable. This is Hal Harvey talking with Tom Friedman, who I'll talk about in a little bit, in New York Times Forum. And this is a quote from a New York Times profile. Hal Harvey headed up this initiative by the foundations and then took over the Climate Works Foundation. Climate change, unlike a lot of large-scale problems, is actually one that is solvable. It's also one where we know what we need to do. We have the best data in the world on how to prevent climate change. Everything was ranked by magnitude, location, and sector. It's a systematic approach to problem solving. So their view of the problem of climate change was a highly technocratic one. There was no discussion in the report of social inequality, income inequality, social political barriers to action, and almost no discussion of the need for effective communication, public involvement, or engagement, or the role of the media for that matter as well. It was science and economics that would enable us to understand the problem and solve the problem through the marketplace. So what I did then is I put together a database of the major foundations that came together behind this strategy. These are some of the biggest foundations in the world. Hewlett Foundation, Packard Foundation, Kresge, and I had a database of 1,248 grants. And each grant has a very short description of that grant. And I was able then to code each grant by its policy focus, its technology focus, and its political strategy or its communication strategy. So between 2008 and 2010, there was $368 million in grant money distributed on climate and energy by these foundations. There's some missing data there, so it's more like $500 million if you fill in some of that missing data. And when I looked at the emphasis of programs, this is just taking some of that data and looking at the key emphasis, they followed their strategy very effectively. They had a strategy, and that defined, that framed for them their investments, their calls for proposals, and then what proposals they decided to fund. And this was defined around, as I'll talk about later, a carbon pricing and soft energy path strategy, where societal change would come through achieving a price on carbon through an international agreement and cap and trade, and then investment in renewables and efficiency strategies. Now, that's not the only way to think about the solutions to climate change. A lot of experts would say, well, we need a broader portfolio of investments than just that narrow slice. And you can see when we start to think about some of the other dimensions of social change, as we'll talk about, many experts argue that we need innovation in so-called hard energy paths, nuclear energy. We need to consider natural gas as a bridge fuel. We need to consider things like carbon capture and storage. Even if those are uncertainties and risks involved, we need to at least explore them and evaluate them. There was almost no funding in those areas, and not a single grant devoted to evaluating the potential of nuclear energy. And then just as importantly, what Pope Francis is talking today about, or the public health dimensions of climate change I showed you earlier, there was almost no investment in talking about climate change as a human security problem or a social justice problem. So almost no investment in adaptation and resilience, protecting public health, and almost no grants devoted to questions of social justice and equity. So I thought to myself, like, these are really smart people. In some cases, have been working on climate change for 25, 30 years. What shaped their understanding of the complexities of climate change in such a narrow way that had huge consequences then for driving, really defining the work of the NGO civil society community and the political approach and the technical approach to climate change? Because foundations have a huge framing effect. They put out calls for proposals, and because organizations need funding, they start to align their programs around how foundations and funders are defining a problem and what they're likely to be funded. And then they provide resources for acting on some things over others. So there's got to be something going on here. And so I released, this study came out as part of a report. There was a lot of debate about it. And then I went away to sabbatical to the Shorenstein Center at the Kennedy School of Government. And I said, okay, I've always studied public opinion. I've always studied general trends in media coverage. I need to look at the meaning makers. I need to look at the public intellectuals, people like Al Gore, people like Bill McKibben, whom all of you know. How are the stories that they're telling about climate change, the intellectual traditions that they draw upon, their framing of the problem, their books, their articles, the documentaries that talk about their books and their articles, their advocacy. How are they creating the lenses through which we understand that decision makers like funders, other journalists, members of activist groups, political leaders, how are they influencing debate? And so I wrote this paper. This was sort of my first pass at sort of moving into a new area in terms of research, this white paper on Bill McKibben, looking at his career. Well, first starting out as I'll talk about what is a public intellectual? How do they influence us? Where do they gain their authority? And then looking at the arc of his career. You know, what's his background? What infuses his own outlook on the world and on climate change specifically? What intellectual traditions does he draw upon in his writing? And how has he influenced debate? What impact has he had? And what kind of controversy has there been around his arguments, both strengths and weaknesses? And those are the things that I'm going to focus on with a broader set of individuals and public intellectuals. Okay, but before we get there, what kind of problem is climate change? I showed you earlier that when the foundations were thinking about climate change, they were talking about it as a conventional environmental problem, like acid rain or smog, something that was easily solvable. But a lot of policy scientists, I know this is a New England term, a Massachusetts term to call things wicked, but there's a tradition of research in the policy sciences talking about wicked problems or super wicked problems. And around the time that I went on sabbatical, I read this great book that I would recommend to anyone in the room, Why We Disagree About Climate Change by Mike Hume, who's a scientist, and he headed up the Tyndall Center on climate change research in the UK, their big interdisciplinary research center. And as a scientist, being introduced to both the social sciences and the humanities, he started to change the way he thought about climate change as a social problem, in its meaning and its significance. And he wrote this terrific book, which was really sort of his own investigation of this idea. And he helped popularize this idea that climate change is not a conventional problem, but a wicked one. And so what's a wicked problem? A wicked problem is not conventionally solvable. It doesn't have any, it's something that we do better at worse at managing over time. We're not going to end climate change. We can avoid the worst impacts. And maybe in some cases we can build a stronger society out of responding to the problem. But it's not something we're going to end or we're going to win at, just like we're not going to end poverty, even though we would like to. We're not going to end cancer. We're not going to end income inequality. These are things we'll do better or worse at managing. They have more than one cause. Oftentimes those causes are difficult to define. Climate change is a modern condition that actually grows out of the success of society. It's tangled up with things like industrialization, improved standards of living, population growth, urbanization, globalization, free trade, information technology, technological advancement. Right? And so in some ways, climate change, these problems grow out of things that have benefited society in other ways. So they're even more difficult to then act against, as we'll talk about. And out of this complexity and this ambiguity, right, where oftentimes we think we have a solution to a wicked problem like climate change, like biofuels, but that solution introduces a new part of the problem that we weren't aware of. Out of this complexity, out of this uncertainty, we start to read into the problems our hopes for a better society. Climate change becomes an opportunity for advocates and experts as a wicked problem to argue on behalf of a society that aligns with their own values and worldviews. As Mike Hume writes about in a separate set of essays, climate change is a synecdoche, a figurative turn of phrase in which something stands in for something else, for something much more important than simply the ways our humans are changing the weather. So for that set of foundations and people who advocate on behalf of carbon pricing and a soft energy path, climate change is a way to shift society towards a different types of energy reliance. These are long-standing, in many cases, there's long-standing advocates for renewables over fossil fuels. The soft energy path was introduced in the 1970s as a way to argue against reliance on oil, but also nuclear energy. So climate change is a crisis, is a problem that enables them to act upon and move society in direction they believe to be a better society. That's just an example, and I'll talk about some other examples in a second. Okay, so since the failure of cap and trade, since this was the dominant framing of climate change as a market-based problem through 2011, 2011 also coincides with 2010 at the Copenhagen meetings, the rise of the so-called climate justice movement in protests at Copenhagen, and then through the work of 350.org, which is headed up by Bill McKibben, as most of you probably are familiar with that organization. And today, as part of the climate justice movement, you see a completely different framing of the issue than that was applied by the major foundations and environmental groups in the build-up to cap and trade. That framing still exists, but now you're seeing an alternative dimension. And this was maybe perhaps best captured in the People's Climate March that happened last fall, and in Naomi Klein's best-selling book, internationally best-selling book, This Changes Everything. In this case, climate change is fundamentally, it is a market problem, but it's not solvable through the market. In fact, climate change reveals all the problems that people on the left have been arguing about relative to capitalism since Marx, as she argues. This is the ultimate I told you so for the left, going all the way back to Karl Marx. As she talks about in her book, in the documentary that's out now about the book, our economic model is at war with life on Earth. We can't change the laws of nature, but we can change our growth economy, and that's why climate change is not just a disaster, it's also our best chance to demand and build a better world. She expresses strong criticism and skepticism of the major environmental groups and funders of action on climate change. She said we can't rely on them to fix this problem or address this problem because they've bought too much into these market-based capitalist principles. In fact, we have to upend assumptions about capitalism. And in doing so, we can make a better world. Climate change, for all those people on the left who've been working on social inequality, racial injustice, disparities between the developed world and the undeveloped world, or the emerging democracies and economies. This is the ultimate opportunity. This is your best opportunity to right the wrongs of colonialism and slavery, as she argues in the book. And the book is an amazing work of public intellectual. It's a deep synthesis, as I'll talk about, of different strands of intellectual traditions and research, and a strong critique in a very compelling way of society. It's not for everyone. There's a lot of disagreement and criticism of the book as well. But as part of this argument, there's also a strong technological argument that we can't rely on technological innovation, hard energy path solutions like natural gas or nuclear energy. These solutions can't be trusted because as Bill McKibben has argued, they prolong the original sin of materialist, consumption-based, market-based economy. It allows us to overlook the flaws in how we've organized society. Instead, we need to degrow our economies and focus on soft, locally appropriate soft energy paths, efficiency, solar, wind, and local organic farming practices. And I'll come back to this technology argument. So one of the things that 350.org has pioneered, along with Bill McKibben and others, is what a former doctoral student of mine at American University wrote a dissertation on, is internet-enabled organizing strategies. They take traditional face-to-face organizing strategies and they amplify them. They allow them to be more successful with limited resources by using things like Twitter, email distributions, Facebook, and really advanced online organizing strategies. So during the People's Climate March and almost every event, they put together a hashtag on Twitter that frames the significance of the event. And in some cases, they've collapsed Twitter momentarily, or say they have. In this case, the hashtag was People's Climate. It immediately tells you that societal change happens not through the market, but through a new global consciousness that challenges the status quo. And this is also signified in the march. But during that march, Andrew Revkin, who's another public intellectual I'll talk about, said, well, don't forget about people's energy. He started tweeting, has a lot of followers. Someone like Bill McKibben, I think, has something close to 100,000 followers. Revkin, I think, has like 50,000. They can call attention to different dimensions and sort of shape discourse online about these issues as they happen. Don't forget about people's energy, which is a frame device that introduces a third interpretation of this issue that other public intellectuals argue around. And what they argue is that market-based strategies are not enough, and a social justice movement is not enough. In fact, what both overlook are the energy access needs of developing countries. And this is a graph that is put together by Clean Air Task Force, which is a NGO based here in Boston. This takes countries aligned along the Human Development Index here on the left, and then along the bottom you see the annual per capita electricity consumption. And what it shows you is the strong relationship between energy access, energy consumption, and the Human Development Index of a country, which is based on things like life expectancy, literacy, education, standards of living. So you see European countries, Japan, the United States, Canada, all here on the upper side, right-hand side of the graph. Over here on the left, you have all these developing economies and countries. All these countries want to be over here. They're in a race to be over here. It's like the competition between like BU, Northeastern, or Harvard and MIT, right? They all want to be over here. And in order to get there, they need more access to energy. And the argument that they make is that renewable energy sources right now are not going to be able to meet their energy access needs. And we have to think about a broader portfolio of technologies, things like carbon capture and storage that allows them to have coal power, advanced nuclear energy, if we're going to meet, which is also a moral issue, allowing these countries to advance their economies and their societies in terms of human development. This is an argument that's made by people like Jeffrey Sachs, Nicholas Stern, as I'll talk to in a second, so-called eco-modernists. And as you look around the world, they also talk about the dramatic changes that we're starting to see, right? We might not see unless we travel across the world, but if you look at the difference between Shanghai in 1990, just 1990, this is a postcard image, right? Shanghai looks like it was still in colonial times, and this is Shanghai today. This is just the dramatic growth in population and urbanization that's happening around the world. If you look at Dubai, this looks like Las Vegas in, I don't know, 1800. That's just Dubai in 1990. This is Dubai today. Right? So this incredible urbanization, rising levels of consumption, and rising levels of energy needs. And you're not going to power Shanghai by way of renewables. You're going to have some type of mix of coal, nuclear, and renewables and efficiency strategies to power it. And that takes innovation, and it takes government action. And then if you look at worldwide energy consumption trends, in this bright red here, that's the consumption of renewables versus in the gray you have coal, in the green you have oil. And even though we've made huge progress on renewables, there's still an incredibly small slice of energy consumption worldwide. And when you break this out even more, you can see where renewables have been most expanded have been in developed countries, North America, Europe, and Asia. And in the fastest growing areas, Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and Central America, there's almost no development of renewables whatsoever. So how do we jumpstart renewables in these countries and meet their energy demands? And then if you look within countries here, this is from the New York Times, the countries that have been able to shift most dramatically their economies to clean energy sources have done so through hydropower and nuclear. Germany is trying to do that. They still have a strong reliance on oil, coal, and natural gas. So there's a huge technological decarbonization challenge that the other two framings of the problem don't adequately address, is the criticism. Okay, so who's offering up these arguments, right? These are arguments that academics are making. It's there in the literature. If you read journal articles, if you take courses, you'll see this presented in the academic literature by different experts and by different organizations. But on top of that, then, come our public intellectuals, our meaning makers, who make sense of all this complexity, reduce it down, synthesize it, and articulate its moral meaning and its political significance. And one of the things I needed to do is to look at the literature in this most recent paper that came out last year on who is a public intellectual. What does the research say about the attributes of public intellectual and what their impact might be? First thing is they are popularizers. There's many academics who are popularizers, but public intellectuals, they can be academics, they can work for, they can be journalists, they can work at think tanks, but what they do is they write best-selling books and they write in the popular media. They translate expert information. And in doing so, they synthesize a lot of material. They might be journalists, but they think like scholars. If you read Naomi Klein's book, it's a tremendous synthesis and integration of knowledge. So there's a lot of academics who are popularizers, but they don't have the third trait of a public intellectual, as the literature talks about. And that is that they're social critics. They're arguing for change. They're iconoclasts. They have a critical view of the world. They're challenging the status quo, or they're advocating on behalf of specific political directions or policy outcomes. And then I needed to look at, so how do they influence people, right? Where does their authority come from, other than the fact that they might have advanced credentials, but others don't? They have a lot of expert knowledge, but a lot of people have expert knowledge. So how do they reach people? How do they gain a following? How do they gain attention for their ideas and the credibility of their ideas? One of the ways they do so is they're always blurring the analytical with the personal. They're taking stories about, they're doing this deep synthesis and explanation of expert information, but they're blending it in with a personal story. So for example, Al Gore's film Inconvenient Truth was also a personal story of him and his wife recovering from the death of their son, and also his recovery from a loss in 2000. Bill McKibben takes you on a journey, not only understanding the problem of climate change, but then you meet people like renewable energy entrepreneurs and local sustainable farmers and advocates who represent a point of view. Tom Friedman in his columns takes you into CEO suites. He gives you the view of the business class and what the business class thinks in terms of technology entrepreneurs, experts, and CEOs. And in their visual portrayal and their writing, this is particularly the case for someone like Naomi Klein or Bill McKibben on the more activist spectrum, right? They have to portray that they walk the walk. There's an authenticity that they have to show. So Bill McKibben's house, for example, is super energy efficient. And there's always discussion about and criticism about Bill McKibben flying across the world and what that might mean. And that's a criticism he always has to respond to. And then finally, most are not just celebrities and personalities, they're also commodities. Ironically enough, for someone like Bill McKibben, Naomi Klein, but particularly someone like Tom Friedman, there are huge financial transactions happening in and around their works. Their books are bestsellers, and then their own books are, and their own authorities being used to sell other books. And they're being translated in things like documentaries and TV programs and other types of commodified outcomes. And then most of them do their work through best-selling books, historically and traditionally, and they write for our elite news organizations, the New Yorker, the New York Review of Books, the New York Times. But over the last 5 to 10 years, they've also taken advantage very successfully of our online media ecosystem. And when they write an article like Bill McKibben did for Rolling Stone, or Tom Friedman writes a column about climate change at the New York Times, what it does is it evokes this huge online spiral of attention, meta-commentary around that article. So 350.org, with a huge social media following, immediately calls attention to the Rolling Stone article. Bloggers do as well, other journalists. And the Rolling Stone article almost instantly becomes this viral sensation. It's the most widely read article in the history of Rolling Stone. And then several months later, they launched a whole new social movement, a divestment movement, based on the principles and the framing of that article. When 350.org and Bill McKibben were protesting the Keystone Pipeline, Tom Friedman wrote a column at the New York Times saying, well, they might not be successful, but I support the protest. And immediately they flag that and they call attention to that column because it's a third-party endorser of their efforts, someone that's maybe an unlikely ally. And Bill McKibben, who combines as part of his analysis a personality and a sense of humor, has a huge Twitter following, then tweets, we're definitely putting Tom Friedman on the guest list for the next civil disobedience action, and links back to, for his 70 to 100,000 Twitter followers, several times that column. And then that column becomes the most emailed and most widely read article at the New York Times, generating more, so these reinforcing spirals of attention. And so in the past, when a public intellectual would write a popular book in English, people would have to wait for that book to be translated or be released in their country in order to read it. But now they're able to reach a global audience of people not just interested in climate change, but particularly interested in how they portray or frame climate change in a way that's appealing to them and helps them articulate their own ideas and their own positions, and might offer up a call to action. And so through their writings and their online accessibility and these spirals of attention, it feeds the process of the formation of a global movement. And this has been particularly the case with 350.org and the climate justice movement, propelled along by Bill McKibben and Naomi Klein. But the biggest impact of public intellectuals is their framing impact. And another book that I would recommend to anyone in the room is this book, sort of a classic now, The Politics of the Earth, looking at environmental discourses and the different intellectual traditions across time and how we thought about the environment. It's by an Australian scholar, John Dryzek. And there's some other work that's been done on the impact of public intellectuals. But in writing a popular book, in writing a Rolling Stone article like Bill McKibben did, what they're doing is they're setting the frame, the context of perception around climate change, focusing on certain dimensions over others, providing a storyline. And without explicit coordination, by reading these books, how many people read Bill McKibben before you arrived at college, or in an introductory course here in college? Right? Others have read, how many people have read Naomi Klein since the book has come out, either in or outside of college? These become organizing devices. They become pieces of software by which then shapes your view of the world. You're probably already inclined to accept their arguments already. That's why you were attracted to the book. But through these discourses, they become then sort of the implicit, informal ways that a whole bunch of organizations and activists and experts come together to informally coordinate their actions. These discourses help people perceive the issue in the same way and align around the same set of solutions. But one of the dangers then is that these interpretations can become locked in. They can lead to groupthink. And so you need other public intellectuals to come along and to challenge these assumptions, as we'll talk about as the eco-modernists do. So in this paper that just came out, essentially starting with my sabbatical up until about last year, I probably read about 60 works by various public intellectuals on climate change. And I'll show you who those public intellectuals are in a second. And in reading those works and reading works by people like John Dryzek, I try to put them together into 3 discrete, unique discourses, narratives, frames of reference around the problem. And I talk about that in the paper. And then I boil it down to a single table. I'll show you this table in a second. For those of you writing academic articles, even if you're doing a qualitative, sort of critical, literary type article, summarizing things in tables can be very effective. This table I'm about to show you has been tweeted something like 5,000 to 10,000 times on Twitter, just as an image. And people have found it very useful as a framing device, as an organizing device. This is difficult to read, but this is taking 3 different groups of high-profile authors and public intellectuals about climate change, talking about how they each reflect a unique intellectual tradition and discourse, and summarizing their problem framing, their outlook on nature, their outlook on technology, what proposals they advocate for, and their model of social change. And here you can see almost immediately as you start to look at this table, how some arguments align with different policy approaches, NGO groups, activist groups, and thinkers over others. And these are really the dynamics of the debate within the community, really on the center left and on the left, who are arguing for action on climate change. And there's a lot of disagreement among these 3 communities, a lot of challenges and a lot of critiques across these different communities. So the first group I call the ecological activists, people like David Suzuki, Bill McKibben, Clive Hamilton, George Monbiot. At essence, climate change fundamentally is a problem with globalization and capitalism. It's only solvable by challenging the status quo, upending our assumptions about capitalism. Nature itself is this sacred, almost religious thing that must be protected at almost any cost. It's sacred and religious in that it's a place like the wilderness that we go to lose ourselves, like the Garden of Eden, and to redeem ourselves. Their outlook on technology is a soft energy path, but even more so than that, that energy has to be locally appropriate and has to be reduced down to scale, and it has to be people-owned, not by big corporations, but locally controlled, including farming as well. Their policy proposals, they sort of reluctantly supported things like carbon pricing and a market-based approach and international agreement, but their policy approaches really focus on regulation, rationing, as they argue, the eventual need for rationing, the localization of economies, a retreat from globalization, restrictions on free market, egalitarian food systems, economic systems, and energy systems that are locally controlled and governed. And social change, though, starts not with the market and not with expertise or technological innovation, but with a mass uprising, a mass social movement that challenges the status quo. We can't trust those in power to do what is right, is the argument. The second group are the smart growth reformers. They reflect the thinking of the major foundations I showed you, people like Tom Friedman, Jeffrey Sachs, a very famous economist, Amory Lovins, who is an energy analyst, renewable energy analyst, efficiency analyst, Nicholas Stern, the former economist of the World Bank. For them, climate change is the ultimate market failure. It's only corrected by putting a price on carbon. Their view on nature is that nature has limits, yes, but it can be stretched indefinitely if the right market-based principles are applied. And in this case, social change or policy action and technological innovation starts with a price on carbon. If you put a price on carbon, that will lock in the technologies, the innovations that we need. Now, someone like Gore argues the price of carbon is all we need, and technologies are all we need are things like renewables and efficiency. Where there's disagreement is that people like Stern and Sachs, especially recently, have said if we're going to decarbonize the world economy and meet the energy access needs of countries, we need more than just carbon pricing renewables. We need government R&D, and we need to consider things like nuclear energy and carbon capture. Their policy instruments are legislation, pricing carbon, a call for a binding international agreement, and it's market mechanisms that are at the source of social change, though recently they've been strong endorsers also of the type of mass mobilization that the ecological activists are leading. And then this final group are less well known, but they're rising as an intellectual movement. They are self-described, they call themselves as the eco-modernists. They recently released something called the Eco-Modernist Manifesto. And these are people like Mike Hume, Roger Pelkey Jr., Ted Nordhaus, and Michael Schellenberger, who run the Breakthrough Institute. They argue that climate change has been fundamentally misdiagnosed as an environmental problem. It's not an environmental problem. It's an energy and innovation problem. They argue that nature is far more resilient and less fragile than we think. And that an innovative, high-energy planet where we have a lot of urbanization can actually decouple economic growth and human development from environmental impacts. Along with things like, and then what they argue is that renewables are not capable of meeting our energy access needs. And they're often accused of being neoliberals, of being market fundamentalists, but they're not. They're actually statists. What they argue is the market is not enough. There needs to be a strong role of government. Just like we built the Tennessee Valley Authority and the role during the Great Depression and the role of government in stimulating the economy and social development in the country, we need to apply that model across the world. And we need to consider renewables in combination with things like natural gas, tightly regulated and controlled, carbon capture and storage, nuclear energy. And there's no single policy approach or technology that's going to solve this problem. In fact, the wider menu of approaches we have, so-called a clumsy portfolio of approaches, the more likely people are to arrive at compromise around and consensus around action. Why? Because people on the left and the right and the middle will see something for everyone. We're not appealing to one worldview over another. And ultimately, political action happens through lowering the cost of technology and through technological innovation, and then closely always questioning our own assumptions, and through sort of critical discourse and open debate, the challenging of ideas and assumptions. Okay, so I'll skip this, but I'll say that now I'm going to wrap up. The next thing that I'm working on now is a book project with a colleague of mine, formerly at American University, where we extend beyond public intellectuals in the climate change space, and we look at public intellectuals writing across a whole set of so-called risk society issues, calling them the meaning makers, public intellectuals in a world at risk. We're looking at debates over the economy, technology, food, climate change, of course, other environmental issues, the nature of science itself, globalization, terrorism, racial injustice and discrimination. I'm sure you know many of these authors here. So that's a book that will be coming out probably about 18 months as we work our way through it. Okay, so just to wrap up, what role can a university like Tufts University, what's the implications for thinking about the role of the university? One of the things that I've argued in other writing is that we need a lot more synergy, like the Institute on the Environment does here, a lot more synergy, so-called four cultures approaches. So the environmental studies major, we're talking this morning about the different concentrations, reflects this four culture approach, where the social sciences, the environmental sciences, the humanities, and things like philosophy and communication research, and the creative professions, which includes filmmaking and journalism. It's only by bringing these disciplines together, both through research and activities and through education, that we can actually really understand climate change and social problem and other environmental issues, and then build consensus around solutions that are effective. And the other thing that I'm interested in, this was an article that just came out in the Journal of Environmental Studies and Sciences, and I wrote about it at my blog, my column at The Conversation. These were recent undergrads who are now in graduate school who did a content analysis of syllabi at about 25 to 30 environmental studies programs across the country. And they used the typology I just showed you, the table, to analyze what kind of authors were being assigned in the environmental studies courses. What was the diversity of thought that was being assigned in environmental studies courses? What they found was that there was a heavy emphasis on ecological activists and some on the smart growth reformers, but almost no mention of the eco-modernists. And so they end, and one of the people works for Resources for the Future, the other one's in graduate school at Arizona State. They said, looking back as recent undergrads, we should have been exposed to these ideas earlier. Because even if we disagreed with them, it would have helped us think more critically about the problem, about arguments, and about solutions. Okay, so I'm out of time. If you want to read more about the studies, I put a blog post up on my website, climateshiftproject.org. You can download the slides, and there's a link there in that blog post to all the different studies I mentioned. And you can also see a course that I teach at Northeastern called Environmental Issues, Communication, and Media, where the whole reading list is there, and it's linked to all the different readings if you want to follow up on some of these topics more in depth. Thanks.
We have time for questions. If you could repeat the question.
Yeah, definitely. questions. Yes.
How do you maintain as a researcher sort of this objective approach of all these arguments without getting sucked into like because it's such a huge permanent issue and
Yeah.
really critical, getting sucked into a certain kind of argument and as opposed to maintaining a sort of objective research-based approach of looking at every argument.
Okay, so the question was, as a researcher, how do you maintain an objective approach to analyzing climate change and social problem, debate around it? And it's always a challenge for I'm trained as a social scientist. I do social science research. Even when you're doing public opinion research, within the area of people doing public opinion studies, knowing the field really well, serving as a reviewer, publishing in that area, you know, I can classify different lines of scholarship as reflecting unique worldviews. There are researchers who are studying the politics of climate change and public opinion about it, who are definitely align themselves as ecological activists. In fact, Naomi Klein draws heavily on their work in her book, and they served as informal advisors on the book, and they're credited in the book in her acknowledgments, right? So even in doing peer-reviewed sort of quantitative empirical work like that, your work is going to draw upon a set of assumptions, the questions you ask, how you interpret the results, and also the implications. For example, another example, you know, I've been looking at climate change now for more than a decade, and looking at analysis of media coverage, public opinion, there's an extreme, one of the reasons I started doing this research, there's an extreme overbalance of work looking at climate denial, which is really important to look at, right? But if you then compare it back to what are the opinion processes related to, say, liberal ideology, environmental values, left of center media and how they frame the solution, some things I talked about here, there's almost no research in that area, even though it's really important. We need that sort of comprehensive view. We have a lot of research on conservative foundations, or at least a lot of investigative journalism, but the study that I showed you is the only analysis of the left of center foundations and how they frame the problem, what the significance of it is. Right, so, and then when you start then to assess the arguments of public intellectuals, it becomes even more difficult. And I would say that at heart, romantically, I'm an ecological activist. I read Bill McKibben. It really appeals to me, especially his talk about more time for family, more time for what really matters in life. And, you know, I only consume local agriculture. We live up in Newburyport. We live in a Bill McKibben type of town. But intellectually, I am attracted by the eco-modernist arguments, even though I think they have weaknesses that they're sorting out and critiques of it that are valid. Again, so it's difficult. It's difficult, and there's no objective, truly objective science. And so you have to, as a student, you have to only through experience and reading and through courses. And that's why it's important to have this diversity of viewpoints in your courses as well in terms of readings. There's another question over here. Yes.
I was really interested in your framing around the role of public health and helping bring the deniers and the people who are on the fence, kind of skeptical, into thinking about climate change. I guess but then the other quote that's sitting in me is like, you only need to convince 51%. So those aren't part of the 51%. Want to get a new law passed. So I heard that framing. So do we actually need people to be working on the health perspective, the national security perspective, and the eco perspective, the sort of nature perspective?
Yeah.
Are they actually building a larger coalition by all of these different framings coming out?
Yeah. So I think I've written about this. There's a tendency even among researchers to think that societal action, policy action will happen once we cross this imaginary threshold of acceptance of the science and policy support. So if we get to 70%, 80% acceptance. But I did some consulting work for NGO group in DC. If you look at political science literature, there's no clear consensus on under what conditions does public opinion drive policy action. And in this work that I did looking at different case studies like the healthcare debate, the debate over smoking, when they finally achieved the first legislation on smoking after 50 years, or when they passed secondhand smoking bans, it was like bare majority support for those pieces of legislation and those policies. And for the Healthcare Act, there was less than majority support. Even among Democrats, they're fairly divided on the Health Care Act. So all of that action happened in the absence of strong, solidified public opinion. So I think on climate change, what's increasingly clear is that these different frames of reference matter because they mobilize so-called issue publics. Smaller segments of the public across sectors, from the public health sector, from the minority sector. The public health message has been very important in terms of making climate change relevant to minority communities, because they're the ones that face the gravest public health threats. It's an important political constituency. But it's really the deepening of opinion intensity and the diversifying of that opinion intensity into communities, states, and regions where before public's been has not been mobilized, has not been active on the issue. And it's also broadening the stakeholder groups, the interest groups who are working on it. So from higher education to business to public health to national security to religion, right? Bringing all these new constituency groups that are all interest groups into their own right, social movements onto their own right, into alignment with, say, environmental advocates, instead of environmental advocates always acting on their own, which has been which was pretty much the case in the build-up to cap and trade. Okay, one more question. I know it's very hot in here, so everyone's dying. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. 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 Yeah. 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 Right. So yeah, so real quick, I'll just say that, and I see if I can respond just real briefly. The first on conflict, what you see around, for example, these clashes among public intellectual groups. Each public intellectual group has its own kind of segment of the media where arguments kind of go unquestioned. So the left, sort of copying the right, and this is also foundation funded, has done a really good job of putting together its own media and communication infrastructure. So the same funders of 350.org are the same funders of Mother Jones, The Nation, documentaries that are coming out, investigative journalism, things like Inside Climate News. And so we have an entire dialogue space, an entire idea space where you only have, everyone agrees climate change is a problem, but in that dialogue space, there's a very particular framing of the issue and solution set. And any rival ideas are immediately dismissed. And so I've done some other articles writing about, and I end this article on public intellectuals, is that that's a problem. And it's not in line with the liberal tradition of thought either. We need more forums where people are respectively engaging with a diversity of intellectual discourses about this problem and a wider menu of solutions and ideas. And we can't have this immediate dismissal and disciplining effect. So we see that over and over again. And so universities can play a role in that, and other news organizations. Andrew Revkin's blog at .earth is a key example of that forum space for diversity of ideas. And the second argument, and I think there's more of an answer there, but I would say that a lot of these principles apply. I would love to do a study of Boston and New England region to look at the role of funders in the media and public intellectuals in shaping state-level debates over energy options, climate change resilience, and political action. And because I think the same methods, the same principles, the same theories can apply to a regional. So how do each region has a different mix of problems and solutions that are needed. And within those regions, how is that conversation happening that ends up framing that debate and decisions that are being made? And ultimately, what's the role of experts in universities in helping broker that dialogue? What are the options that are being considered? So thank you.